Nobody in Caldwell Creek talked about Thomas Harrell the way they talked about other men. They didn't gossip about his temper, or his drinking, or his debts. What they said about Thomas was quieter than that, and somehow harder to shake. They said he hadn't smiled, not really smiled, since the year his father died and left him 40 acres of dry land, a leaking roof, and a clause in a will that nobody saw coming. The clause was simple, cruel in the way that practical things sometimes are. Thomas had until his 32nd birthday to marry, or the land would pass to his Uncle Gerald, who would sell it before the ink dried on the deed. Thomas had turned 31 in April. It was now the second week of June. He hadn't told anyone about the will, not his neighbor Dale Pearson, who would have pitied him, not the Reverend, who would have made it a sermon. He'd folded the lawyer's letter twice, pressed it flat under the family Bible, and sat with it for 3 weeks before he did anything at all. What he did was write an advertisement, 12 lines in the Caldwell Creek Courier and 2 other papers farther east. He kept the language plain. Rancher, 31, seeks a woman of steady character for honest marriage. No pretense. Fair arrangement. Respond to Box 9, Caldwell Creek, Texas. He expected nothing. He received 4 letters. 3 of them he set aside within the first paragraph. 1 was barely legible. 1 asked for a photograph before anything else. And 1 included a list of demands that made him fold the paper slowly and place it in the stove. The 4th letter he read twice, then a 3rd time, and then he set it on the table and looked at it for a long while before picking it up again. It was from a woman named Elaine Grayson. She wrote from a town called Millhaven, 2 days east by rail. Her handwriting was careful without being stiff. She didn't describe herself in flattering terms the way the others had. She said she was 28, that she had been a schoolteacher for 4 years, that she was not looking to be rescued, and hoped he wasn't looking for someone who needed rescuing. She said she understood what a practical arrangement meant, and that she respected the honesty of it. She said one more thing, near the end, that stayed with Thomas longer than anything else she wrote. I am not afraid of hard work, or hard weather, or hard silences. I've lived with all 3. He wrote back the same evening. Elaine Grayson read Thomas Harrell's reply standing at the window of the room she rented above the Millhaven dry goods store. It was a small room. She had made it livable. A cotton quilt on the narrow bed, 2 books on the sill, a tin cup she kept filled with whatever wildflowers she could find along the road to school. Small dignities, the kind a person collects when larger ones aren't available. She had not written to Thomas Harrell on a whim. She had thought about it for 11 days after seeing the advertisement, which a colleague had pointed out with the kind of smirk that Elaine had learned to ignore. She had written the letter and torn it up twice before the 3rd version satisfied her. She was not a woman who acted without thinking. She was also not a woman who let thinking become an excuse for standing still. Her situation in Millhaven was not dire. That was important to understand. She had her salary. She had her room. She had, for the most part, her dignity. What she did not have was a future that looked any different from her present. And at 28, in a town where every available man had either married young or left for somewhere better, the horizon had begun to feel less like a possibility and more like a wall. Thomas's reply was short. That didn't bother her. It confirmed the details, the ranch, the land, the arrangement, and asked if she would be willing to come for a visit before any decision was made. He said she was under no obligation. He said the train fare would be reimbursed either way. That last part was the one that moved her. Not because of the money, but because it meant he understood she would need a way out if things weren't right. It meant he'd thought about her side of it. She wrote back that she would arrive on the Friday train. Thomas was at the station 20 minutes early, which was not like him. He stood near the far end of the platform with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim, the way he did when he didn't know what to do with himself. He had told himself he wasn't nervous. He had almost believed it until the train whistle sounded in the distance, and his chest did something he didn't have a name for. He recognized her before she reached the platform steps, not because she matched any description, she hadn't given one, but because of the way she carried herself, straight-backed, unhurried, and a single traveling bag in one hand, and a look on her face that was neither anxious nor performatively calm, just present, aware. She saw him at almost the same moment. She didn't wave or rush forward. She simply walked toward him at the same steady pace, and when she stopped in front of him, she extended her hand the way a person does when they mean business. "Mr. Harrell." "Miss Grayson." They shook hands. It was brief and firm, and neither of them said anything for a moment after. The afternoon light was flat and warm, and somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at nothing in particular. "I appreciate you coming," Thomas said finally. "I appreciate the invitation," she said. It was a perfectly ordinary exchange. There was no reason for it to feel like the beginning of anything. And yet, as Thomas led the way to the wagon, and Elaine fell into step beside him, something shifted in the air between them. Quiet and unannounced, the way weather changes before anyone thinks to look at the sky. He didn't notice it yet, neither did she. But something had started. The ride to the ranch took 40 minutes. Thomas pointed out landmarks with the practicality of a man giving directions, not a tour. The ridge to the north, the dry creek bed that ran full in spring, the Pearson property where the fence line ended. Elaine asked 2 or 3 questions, genuine ones, about the soil, about the nearest town with a school, and Thomas answered them without embellishment. By the time the ranch house came into view, they had established something fragile and useful between them. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of careful respect, and a sense that neither of them was going to waste the other's time. The house was modest. Thomas had known it would look that way to a stranger, and had spent 2 evenings the week before fixing the porch step and straightening the shutters, and then feeling faintly embarrassed that he'd bothered. He watched Elaine look at it, without trying to read her expression. She turned to him after a moment. "It has good bones," she said. He didn't know why that particular phrase hit him the way it did. It was a practical thing to say, a builder's observation, but there was something underneath it, an understanding, maybe, that things didn't have to be perfect to be worth something, that stayed with him long after she'd gone inside. That night, after supper, they sat on the porch in separate chairs and talked about the arrangement. The terms, what the timeline, what each of them expected, and what they didn't. It was a businesslike conversation, and they both held to that, and it worked fine, right up until Elaine asked a question that wasn't in the arrangement at all. "Mr. Harrell," she said quietly, looking out at the darkening field rather than at him, "why hasn't anyone already claimed you?" Thomas was quiet for a long time. When he finally answered, he didn't answer what she'd asked. He said something else instead, something careful and sideways, and just slightly too honest for the kind of conversation they were supposed to be having. And Elaine Grayson, sitting in the dim porch light, with her hands folded in her lap, heard exactly what he hadn't said. Thomas had said he kept to himself because the ranch demanded it. That was the answer he gave, and it was true enough to pass in daylight. But Elaine had heard the pause before it, that half-second of stillness that lives between what a person means and what they decide to say, and she filed it away without comment. She was a schoolteacher. She knew the difference between a wrong answer and an unfinished one. She stayed 3 days that first visit. By the second morning, something in the arrangement of the house had already begun to shift. Not dramatically, just in small, almost invisible ways. The way Elaine set 2 cups on the table without being asked. The way Thomas started making slightly more noise coming in from the barn, so she'd hear him before he appeared in the doorway. Courtesies so small they barely qualified as such, and yet neither of them was unaware of the other offering them. On the second evening, she asked if she could look at the account ledger. Thomas set it in front of her without a word. He stood back and watched her go through it with the same focused quiet she probably brought to grading papers. She didn't flinch at the numbers, which were not good. She didn't offer sympathy either, which he appreciated more than he could have explained. "You're carrying too much on feed," she said finally. "And this supplier," she tapped a column with one finger, "is charging you more than the one in Harrell. Harlow's farther. Not by much. Not enough to justify the difference." Thomas looked at the column. She was right. He'd known she was right before she finished the sentence, actually. But hearing it said plainly by someone who had no reason to spare his feelings made it land differently than his own quiet knowing had. "I'll look into it," he said. She closed the ledger and pushed it back toward him. "The land is good, Mr. Harrell. The rest is just management." He didn't respond immediately. He was looking at her in that careful, sideways way he had, not staring, just observing, the way a man does when he's trying to understand something he doesn't have words for yet. "Thomas," he said. She looked up. "You can call me Thomas. If we're going to go through with this, Mr. Harrell seems like unnecessary distance." A beat passed. Something moved behind her eyes that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite something else. "All right," she said. Thomas." It was the first time she'd said his name, and it sat in the room between them like a quiet thing that had decided to stay. They married on a Thursday morning 3 weeks later. The Reverend came to the ranch rather than the church, which had been Elaine's quiet preference, and which Thomas had arranged without making a point of it. Dale Pearson and his wife Margaret served as witnesses. Margaret cried, which seemed to embarrass her, and which Elaine found unexpectedly touching. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Elaine wore a dress the color of river clay, not white, not trying to be, and Thomas had pressed his good shirt so carefully that the crease down the front was still sharp by noon. They stood side by side in the front room and said the words and meant them in the way that practical people mean things. Seriously, or without theater. Afterward, Margaret Pearson pressed a jar of preserved peaches into Elaine's hands and leaned close and said something low that made Elaine smile in a way Thomas hadn't seen from her yet. He didn't ask what was said. He stored the smile away instead, the way a man stores something he doesn't fully understand, but suspects he'll need later. That evening, they ate supper together as they had every evening since her arrival, except that now the house had a different quality to its silence. Not heavier, just different. The way a room feels after furniture has been moved. Familiar and slightly new at the same time. Thomas washed the dishes. Elaine dried them. Neither suggested this arrangement. It simply happened. And when they were done, he hung the towel on the hook, and she put the last plate in the cabinet. And for a moment they were standing very close together in the small kitchen, and both of them were aware of it. "Good night, Thomas," she said. "Good night, Elaine." She went down the hall. He stood in the kitchen a while longer, looking at nothing in particular, with the feeling of a man who has done something irrevocable and is only now beginning to understand the full weight of it, not with dread, but with something stranger and less nameable than that. The town had opinions, naturally. Caldwell Creek was not a cruel place, but it was an attentive one. People noticed the woman who had arrived on the Friday train and married Thomas Harrell inside a month. But they noticed her straight posture and her precise way of speaking, and the fact that she didn't seem to need anyone's approval, which some people found refreshing and others found unsettling. Martha Cobb, who ran the dry goods store and considered herself the town's unofficial register of social standing, told anyone who would listen that it was a mail-order situation, said with the particular emphasis that meant she thought less of it. Elaine heard this secondhand through Margaret Pearson, who delivered the information with an apologetic wince. Elaine's response was to walk into Martha Cobb's store the following Saturday, purchase a spool of thread and a paper of pins, make pleasant conversation about the weather and the quality of the new flour shipment, and leave without addressing a single word of the rumor. Yet it was a masterclass in dignity that Margaret Pearson recounted to her husband twice that evening. Thomas heard about it and said nothing. But something in his expression shifted in a way that Dale Pearson noticed and decided not to mention. What Thomas hadn't anticipated, what the arrangement, in all its practical clarity, had failed to account for, was how quickly he would begin to look forward to ordinary things. The sound of Elaine moving around the kitchen in the early morning before he came in from the barn, the way she read in the evenings with her feet tucked under her and one finger marking her place even when she wasn't actively turning pages. The questions she asked that were never small talk, always real questions, the kind that required him to think before answering. She asked about his father once, carefully, and he told her more than he'd intended to, and she listened without filling the silences with reassurance, which was the right thing to do and which not everyone understood. He found himself talking to her about the land in a way he'd never talked about it to anyone. Not the management of it. She already understood that. But the feeling of it. The way the light came across the north field in late afternoon. The particular smell of the soil after the first rain of autumn. She listened to all of it. And then, one evening, she said quietly that she'd never had a place that felt like it belonged to her. That she'd spent so long being careful not to want things she couldn't keep, that she'd almost forgotten how to want things at all. Thomas looked at her for a long moment across the supper table. "This place belongs to you," he said. Same as it does to me." It was a simple sentence. He hadn't planned it. Elaine looked down at her plate, and when she looked back up, her expression was composed, as it nearly always was. But something underneath it was different. Something that had been held carefully in place for a very long time had shifted, just slightly, and they both felt it. Neither of them named it. It was too new for names. But 3 days later, Thomas came in from the east fence at midday to find Elaine in the garden she'd started along the south wall of the house, on her knees in the dirt, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, a smear of soil across her forearm, completely absorbed in what she was doing. She didn't hear him approach. He stood at the corner of the house and watched her for a moment. This woman he barely knew and somehow trusted entirely, and felt something open in his chest that he'd kept shut for a very long time. He must have made some sound because she looked up. Their eyes met, and in the half-second before either of them said anything, something passed between them that was not part of any arrangement they had ever agreed to. Elaine looked back down at the garden. Thomas went inside. Neither of them mentioned it at supper. But that night, lying awake in the dark, listening to the sound of the ranch settling around him, Thomas Harrell understood, with the slow, irreversible certainty of a man who has been trying very hard not to understand something, that he was in considerable trouble. The question was whether she was too. And he had no idea how to find out without risking the only thing that had begun to feel, in a long time, like enough. He didn't say anything for 9 days. Thomas was not a man who acted on feeling before he understood it, and what he was feeling didn't lend itself to easy understanding. It wasn't the sharp, obvious thing he might have expected. It was quieter than that. It lived in small moments. The way he angled his chair slightly toward her at supper without noticing. The way he listened for her footsteps in the morning before he was fully awake. The way a conversation with her about something as unremarkable as fence posts left him more settled than a full night's sleep. He worked harder those 9 days than he had in months, rose earlier, stayed out longer, told himself it was the season, the land, the list of repairs that never shortened. Told himself a great many things that were technically true and fundamentally dishonest. Elaine, but for her part, noticed. She didn't say so. She simply went about her days with the same composed steadiness she brought to everything. Tending the garden, managing the household accounts, riding out with him twice that week to check the north fence, sitting a horse better than he'd expected, which shouldn't have surprised him by now, but somehow still did. She was competent at everything she turned her attention to, and she turned her attention to the ranch, the way she turned it to everything else, completely, without pretense, as if it already mattered to her. That was the thing that undid him in the end. Not a single dramatic moment, just the accumulating evidence of a woman who was genuinely, quietly, irreversibly present. It was Margaret Pearson who said the thing that cracked it open. But she came by on a Wednesday with a jar of butter and the particular energy of a woman who had something to say and had been waiting for the right moment. Elaine was in the kitchen. Thomas was on the porch replacing a board, which gave him no reasonable excuse to be elsewhere. Margaret sat at the kitchen table and talked about small things for 20 minutes, while Thomas worked within earshot. Then, in the unhurried way of someone who has been steering toward a point all along, she said to Elaine, "He's different, you know, since you came." There was a pause from inside the kitchen. "Different how?" Elaine said. It wasn't quite a question. "Like a man who's remembered something he thought he'd lost," Margaret said simply. Thomas drove the nail he was holding with rather more force than necessary. On the other side of the wall, but he heard Elaine say something quiet in response that he couldn't make out. He didn't try. He sat back on his heels and looked out at the yard and felt the back of his neck go warm in a way that had nothing to do with the sun. Margaret left an hour later. Thomas came inside to wash up, and Elaine was at the stove, and neither of them referenced anything Margaret had said. But the kitchen felt different. Smaller, maybe, or just more honest. Thomas dried his hands, stood there a moment longer than he needed to. Elaine. She turned. He had not planned what came next, had specifically avoided planning it, in fact, because every version he'd rehearsed in his head had felt wrong. Too formal, too sudden, too much like a man making a declaration when what he actually wanted to do was ask a question. So he asked the question. Are you... He stopped, started again. Are you all right? Here, is this enough for you? It was not eloquent. He was aware of that. He watched her face move through something he couldn't fully read, something careful, and then less careful, and then very still. Are you asking if I'm content? She said slowly. Or are you asking something else? The directness of it nearly stopped him entirely. Something else, he said. The word sat between them. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a warm wind moved through the yard, and the curtain at the window lifted and fell. Elaine set down what she was holding. She turned to face him fully, and for once her composure wasn't a wall. It was just her, steady and clear-eyed and present, looking at him the way she looked at the ledger, or the land, or anything else. She was deciding whether to trust. I used to think, she said, that wanting something was the first step toward losing it, that the safest thing was to need very little and expect less. Thomas didn't move. "I don't think that anymore," she said. "Not since—" She paused. "Not lately." It was the most she had ever given him. He understood that. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and stopped in front of her and looked at her the way he'd been trying not to look at her for weeks, plainly, with nothing managed or held back, and said her name once, quietly, like a man setting something down that he'd been carrying too long. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw. Just that. Just her hand, and the warmth of it, and the way she looked at him as though she had already decided. He covered her hand with his. They stood there in the kitchen while the afternoon light moved across the floor, and nothing was said for a while, and nothing needed to be. The garden along the south wall came in fully by September. Elaine had planted it practically. Herbs near the kitchen end, hardier things toward the fence. But there were flowers, too, tucked in between the useful plants, because she had allowed herself that. A small extravagance, the kind that costs nothing and means everything. Thomas brought her a second chair for the porch without mentioning it. It appeared one evening, positioned at the same angle as his, close enough to pass something between them without reaching. Elaine sat in it that night and looked at the field going gold in the late light, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They talked more easily now. The careful distance of those first weeks had not disappeared so much as transformed into something else, a closeness that had earned its comfort, that knew the shape of the other person's silences and didn't feel the need to fill them. Thomas told her things he hadn't told anyone. She told him things she'd stopped believing anyone would want to hear. They were not perfect confidences. Some things stayed private, as they should, but they were real ones, and that was rarer. The town adjusted its opinion gradually, the way towns do. Martha Cobb remained privately skeptical for another month before Elaine helped her organize the Harvest Social with such quiet efficiency that skepticism became untenable. Dale Pearson told Thomas over a fence line one afternoon that Elaine was the best thing to happen to the Harrell Ranch in 20 years, which was not a romantic statement, but was offered with genuine feeling and received the same way. Thomas smiled at that. A real smile. The kind that people in Caldwell Creek had not seen from him in some time. By the time the first frost came, they had settled into each other the way people do when they've stopped pretending the arrangement is something less than what it has become. One evening in late October, sitting on the porch after supper with the cold coming in slowly from the north, Elaine leaned her head against Thomas's shoulder without ceremony or announcement. He put his arm around her without comment, as if this too had always been part of the arrangement. They watched the stars come out over the Harrell land, their land, one by one. "Thomas," she said quietly. I'm glad I wrote that letter." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pressed his lips briefly to the top of her head, just once, the way a man does when words feel smaller than the thing he means. "So am I," he said. The following spring, Margaret Pearson brought a quilt to the ranch house as a gift. She claimed it was for the baby's room, and she was right, because Elaine had told her 2 weeks prior, and Margaret had been vibrating with the secret ever since. Yet Thomas opened the door and looked at the quilt, and looked at Margaret's entirely unconvincing expression of casual innocence, and turned back into the house with a sound that was, unmistakably, a laugh. Elaine appeared in the hallway with flour on her hands, and an expression that was trying very hard to be reproachful. "Margaret," she said. "I said nothing," Margaret said, pressing the quilt into Elaine's arms and beaming in a way that made denial pointless. Thomas leaned against the doorframe and looked at his wife, the words still settling into him in new ways, months later, and felt the particular quiet joy of a man who had written 12 lines in a newspaper expecting nothing, and had received, instead, everything that mattered. And somewhere out there, in whatever corner of the world this story has found you, whether you're watching from a quiet room in the early morning or winding down at the end of a long day, I'd love to know where you are. What part of this earth has Thomas and Elaine's story reached tonight? Leave it in the comments. It never stops being remarkable, the distances a simple story can travel. And if something here moved you, or if you think there's a way I could tell it better, something I could do differently next time, I'd genuinely like to hear that too. These stories get better because of the people listening to them. If slow burn stories like this one are your kind of thing, there are more waiting for you.